So good afternoon and welcome back to this second session of this first day. Chiara already introduced me, so I won't waste any further time. I'm a Germanist, so I'm an intruder here, but my only job is to measure time, this unfortunate task to measure time and check if we are on schedule. So I don't like to interrupt anyone. So if I notice that you are actually overcoming the limit of 30 minutes, I'm gonna cough or sneeze to signal that we have 5 more minutes before giving the floor to the audience. So let me introduce our first speaker. Paolo Pesce is Associate Professor of History of Philosophy at the University of Roma Tre. In 2016-17, he was already a Fulbright Research Scholar at New York University. His research ranges from early modern to contemporary philosophy, natural science, and psychology, with a focus on Kant and Kantian legacy. His books include, in Italian, La filosofia della natura in Kant, published in 2009, Meccanica quantistica, rappresentazione e realtà, published in 2012 in cooperation with Bassi and Argentieri. Dalla parte di Alice, La coscienza e l'immaginario, in 2015. Then in English, Soul, Mind and Brain from Descartes to Cognitive Science, Critical History, 2020. And Mechanism, Life and Mind in Modern Natural Philosophy, 2022, in association with Charles Wolff and Antonio Clerici. Paolo Pesce presents a paper with the following title: Materialism, Fictitious Truth, Aesthetic Religion, Friedrich Albert Lange's Interpretation of Schiller and Its Legacy.
Thank you so much. So thank you to the committees for inviting me to this great conference. I slightly changed the title, but basically what I'm going to do is to try to understand why Friedrich Lange chose Schiller as a model for his own interpretation of Kantianism, and how is this related in particular with Schiller's poetry rather than with Schiller's theoretical essays. I won't read. I have a presentation with a lot of texts. I will just run through it and read something in order to outline my argument. So starting from some basic information about how Friedrich Lange sees Schiller as a neo-Kantian. What was his general project, Critique of Materialism? I will also slightly hint at some other figures that might have been references for Lange and why, in order to show why Schiller might have been more fit to his own ideas. And then I will conclude with sketching Lange's ideas about religion, metaphysics and religion, and conclude with just a single slide about the legacy for the sake of the discussion. So Schiller as neo-Kantian, we will hear more about this in Chiara's talk. But basically in the history of materialism, we find this striking statement about the Lange's preference for Schiller as a Kantian, and also as one who managed to understand Kant's mistakes in his own deductions, and he labels Schiller as empowered with the divinatorische Geisteskraft. So he understood some core of Kant's theory going beyond this scholastic framework. And in particular, he likes this poem, The Ideal and Life, and this is an example of how Schiller could have been considered a Kantian without Kant, and he often quotes lines from this poem, especially in the conclusive paragraph of the history of materialism. So a very important point in the book. So we have Schiller at the beginning of this big book and the end of this big book in a section related to religion and ethics that in the second edition is called the Standpunkt des Ideals. So there are, of course, some superficial resonances between the two. First of all, you might remember that Schiller started with medicine and wrote a dissertation about physiology, and he dealt with the problem of connecting nerves and thoughts in a post-Kantian framework. And at the same time, of course, he cared about the problem of understanding how morals fits this physiological background. And he already gave very much importance to the aesthetic ideas. And in particular, he, in his dissertation, mentions melody as an example of beauty. We will see that this same example occurs in Lange. And so there's a quote here about the importance of finding form, of finding the aesthetic element starting from life, from the physical dimension of humans. And this is exactly something that we will find again in Lange. And of course, also the interest in connecting philosophy to poetry. We have heard more about that before. So what was Lange's take? Basically, very elementary introduction to this point. First of all, Lange replaces Kant's a priori with this notion of organization of the mind, which has been considered traditionally as a so-called physiological Kantianism. This definition is a little bit problematic to me because it might suggest that Lange was just reducing the a priori to some physicalist context, whereas he also has the problem of connecting all mental processes to physiological processes, but at the same time saving what we would call some non-reductive element in this picture. So on the one hand, he talks of this organization of the mind, which is basically a phrase that he borrows from Helmholtz, as a biological setup of capacities that replaces the idea of a logically or purely philosophically defined a priori. But then he has passages like the one that I quote here, second paragraph, about the value, the spiritual value that we associate with some sensations in our experience. So on the one hand, there's no value in any part of our experience that is not connected to some physical phenomenon. So we don't have any way to find something spiritually significant or artistically formed outside any ordinary process of sensation, which in turn is connected to physiology. And so in the terminology of contemporary philosophy of mind, we might say that Lange supports a kind of supervenience. Not only sensations, but even the most abstract concepts in the subject have to be connected. And in some passages, it looks like they are identified as an aspect of nerve impulses. So this is an example of how Lange actually accepts many claims of materialism, of contemporary so-called scientific materialism in neurophysiology, but of course in a framework that he takes from Kant, where all of this, including the connection to neurophysiology, is phenomenal. So it doesn't have an absolute metaphysical value as in materialism that he considers a metaphysics. This leads to one of the favorite examples of interpretation of Kant for Lange, which was Helmholtz. We have also to remind that Helmholtz famously introduced some of his ideas about an interpretation of Kant in the framework of physiology in this lecture in 1855, über das Sehen, das Menschen. And Lange started to teach about materialism and these subjects after 2 years. And he was aware of what was happening, and of course he knew about this lecture. So in this lecture, we find this phrase, organization of the mind. Kant's philosophy, according to Helmholtz, investigated the contribution of our particular innate laws of the mind, as it were, of the organization of the mind to our representations. But Helmholtz still says in his work, I won't focus on this now, about a level of investigation where he talks of pure psychology. He talks of free will, he talks of a priori force, for example, space and the law of causality. So it's not all physiological. On the contrary, Lange comments on Helmholtz's work in the history of materialism, saying that it is a very important, exemplary reinterpretation of Kant, and this basically starts from there, by saying that there's no a priori and there's no pure thinking. So everything has to be explained, also can be explained by connecting it to physiology. Even the highest functions of reason are consistent with materialist explanations. There's no I, there's even no I, which was very important, of course, for Kant's a priori, no pure thinking. There's just a connection immanent to experience, as it were. So even separating the I from this psychological process is not necessary. But as I said, this whole picture would have been quite identical with a kind of materialism, were it not for the fact that, according to Lange, this has to be considered as our experience and our scientific and philosophical view of experience in the framework of a phenomenalistic interpretation of experience itself. So even if we connect all our mental processes to some physical mechanism, what is a mechanism? What is a body? All of this is phenomenal, as Kant has thought, because space and time in general are not objects of experiences. So we come now to how Lange thinks we should correct Kant, and then we will see how Schiller enters to this concerning to this problem. So he summarizes Kant's philosophy in 3 points at the end of the section on Kant in the first edition of the History of Materialism. So first doctrine is that the phenomenal world depends on our concepts. Of course, that is not exactly Kant's terminology, but so that's the idea. So all our knowledge as a relative truth, relative in terms of being relative to our organization of the mind. Other animal species would have a different kind of experience, and we don't know so Lange what is the thing in itself. Second point, the ideas in a Kantian sense as ideas of reason don't give us any knowledge. They just lead us to an imagined world. Of course, again, this is not orthodox Kantianism, doesn't sound like Kant, but the point is they don't give us knowledge. They are about something that's beyond the domain of our possible knowledge. And Lange agrees with these 2 general claims. Where he disagrees is that the only absolute that we have as humans is the law, is the moral law that is rationally demonstrated, and that's an absolute validity. So in these 3 propositions, we could summarize, according to Lange, Kant's philosophy, the core of Kant's philosophy. The first 2 can stay, the third is subjective, and so it's temporary, transitional. So we have to discuss about that. In fact, according to Lange, this is the start of his own original take on all these points, which leads to poetry, as we will see. We should reconceive the absolute as a picture, as a symbol, rather than as the idea of some transcendent reality which we cannot know. Last example of a very important author that Lange examines and uses, as it were, in the history of materialism to show how all these contemporary examples were not enough for Lange is Mill. Mill also had an idea, an anti-reductive idea of complex ideas, as he calls them, for example, moral ideas, that cannot be considered as the sum of the effects of the concurring causes. So Lange finds in Mill a similar naturalist view of mental processes as based on neurophysiology, but also a way out of what we would call reductionism. So complex ideas are based on sensational experiences, but they cannot be reduced, considered as the sum of this physiological background. So it's an important reference. He quotes Mill for this idea in the history of materialism. He tries to make sense of this kind of second-order ideas while accepting all the program of the contemporary neurophysiology of mind. Where he's not happy is first with the empiricism itself. According to him, there's a kind of biological, we might say, necessity in empirical inferences, which is based on our organization, but this does not interest us here. But the very important point is also morality. Mill's utilitarianism lacks the understanding of the ideal element in morals that's very important for Lange. It's just based on a calculation of well-being, and it's not enough for Lange to ground what he takes as the proper approach to moral, which is based on ideals. And these ideals are formulated in a new kind of metaphysics that's defined as an art of composition or creation of concepts. That's not about knowledge of any kind, and it's this is a very interesting phrase, a kind of fictionalized truth. We don't get any absolute truth, but we can dichten, we can poetically create some idea of this domain. And in this context, art, fine arts, the beautiful, etc., and the aesthetic element are the first and most important example. The art is free to create, to invent words, and is not logically grounded, but cannot be contradicted. And this is why this is important for Lange to write such a sentence as Beethoven cannot be contradicted, or the Madonna from Raphael includes no mistakes, because he wanted, at the end of the materialism controversy, he wanted to save a level of our experience where materialistic explanations won't reduce the value of our judgments, aesthetical judgments, for example, and then also moral judgments. And this is evident in another sentence that I will quote. So to sum up, there's no truth that here. So there's no materialistic metaphysics, so materialism that of the kind that he was fighting at the time cannot rule out our aesthetic values. And the same can be said about our ethical values. So this is the point that is important for Lange. He grants all the program, but he says there's this level of invention that escapes any materialistic reduction of a metaphysical kind. And the first example is sculpture. But it's an example of the judgment about beauty. And again, he says that Kant wanted to ground morality in a rational way to prove the truth of morality, but this was a mistake, because there's no purely rational way to ground morality in a necessary way. So Lange basically thinks we can replace this with this invention of values that escapes any kind of reduction to materialism. The ethical side of this argument, I have to point out, is related to how materialism was viewed at the time as a kind of pseudo-scientific metaphysics by Lange that entailed also an egoistic ethic. So we're just reduced to our natural desire, and any individual will just follow necessarily, as it were, its own interest conceived in a biological sense. So building on this idea, Lange was actually trying to make sense of a kind of religion that is connected to art. According to Lange, at the end of the history of materialism, religion in cultures that have been the sufficient degree of development has always been connected to art. And what is the important value here is that in art and religion, or religion as connected to art, we have a style that can change over time. So there's no unique form of religion. So it's not necessary how these contents are transmitted in culture. But we have, and that's even more important, an impression on the subject, on the mind of individuals. And this leads to the point that I'm going to underscore here. So why Lange was looking for an aesthetic and poetic dimension to integrate his view of ethics as connected to science. And the second sentence in this slide is taken from Lange's book on Schiller. We'll probably hear more about that from Chiara. He wrote this introduction and commentary to Schiller's poetry, and he writes here that poems, the task of poems is to produce some sacred sense of submission, shoy. Not sure how to translate this. So it is related to religion. It describes the impact on individual minds of a poem to what religion does. Impacts people as religion does, by means of language in an artistic way. And so this leads to the role of Schiller. First of all, Schiller understands the value of poetry, and in so doing, it doesn't follow Kant, which was mistaken in a way that Plato already was taken, of considering the intelligible world as a transcendent reality. According to Lange, the point is that the intelligible world is a world of Dichtung, of poetry or creation, poetic creation. And this is exactly its value, which cannot be cancelled by any scientific doctrine of the brain mind. So this is his point. And we're free to roam in these creations without caring about any reductive view. And poetry, in this sense, also has a value, not only theoretically as a way to approach this intelligible world, but also as a psychological way to contrast the pessimism. And this is the first example of one important point for Lange, what he wanted to get to with this interpretation. He was caring about some way of fighting pessimism in the contemporary context, especially of Germany, as we will see in the next slide. Checking the time. Yeah. So Schiller has rendered the intelligible world in an intuitive way. On the other hand, he was following Plato, another side of Plato, in understanding the need for myth. Think of the myth of air at the end of the Republic, or the myth of the Phaedrus. So this is the Plato that Lange likes, as it were, the Plato that poetically represents this intelligible world in order to impact the life of the citizens in his state. In this sense, so Schiller is the poet of freedom, freedom to investigate, to explore this world poetically, and so he overcomes the metaphysical side of Platonism, but he gets back to the I will call it the rhetorical side of Platonism, with the idea of mythology. So these ideas, and this is the last step in my reconstruction, have been around for quite a while. So the idea of borrowing the idea of mythology from Plato was around in so-called romantic philosophy in Vienna, and many people had said and published similar ideas. For example, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was very close to Schiller, as early as 1789, in his Rede über Religion, writes that we can reconcile morality and sensibility by means of new myths, as Plato did. Schlegel, another important example, talked of a new mythology, which would be the true rejuvenation of poetry in the contemporary culture. And of course, Schiller himself wrote in his essays about this idea. Aesthetic education is not only about reconciliation of body and morality, of nature and morality, also helps to expand our capacity to feel behind this sensible world. And Humboldt congratulated Schiller in a letter by saying, "You are realizing a transition from metaphysics to poetry." What is the difference of Schiller in this context, according to Lange? The difference is poetry. It's not just that he theorizes this idea that we could maybe frame a new mythology. He just does it. And that's the important thing. And this leads to Lange's frequent praise of Schiller's poems as a way of conveying the ideas of religion and moral in a new way, by giving a corporeal shape, as it were, to the idea of transcending the boundaries of experience and of our biology. So Schiller's importance in his poems, rather than in his theory of education, etc., is to provide an example of this sublime overcoming of reality, which is something that we need, according to Lange, and this is the last section of my talk. His idea was very bold, the idea of that we could have a replacement of traditional religion. Something revolutionary might have been happening at the time. And his idea is that this capacity of poetry to overcome the boundaries of ordinary reality with mythology, for example, and to express what is literally unspeakable, is a very important cultural means that he saw as something that was needed in the cultural and political context of his time. For example, he thinks, that might sound rather naive, but gives the idea of what he was thinking at the time, that the Christian doctrine of Erlösung, of liberation, had been actually generalized in an aesthetical fashion by Schiller, with this idea in the poem Ideal and Leben of transcendence of the world. So poetically replaced. And Lange's idea is that, well, he was kind of hoping that religion would not stay as something belonging to church communities, but could be shared in a wider sense and express what he calls the point of view of the ideal. So, which is the core of religion, but it's independent of institutional and dogmatic traditions. So this is what he was thinking. And this was related to what had been recently happening when he was starting to think about this project of a history of materialism. 1848, the revolution, and this context helps to understand at least some of what I've shown, the itinerary leading to this reappraisal of Schiller. For example, Lange praises Fichte not much for the system of transcendental idealism, but for his speeches, for how he was able to produce a poetic Erhebung in the people that were listening to him, talking about the French Revolution and trying to inspire German people politically. So there's a passage almost at the end of the history of materialism, which is very telling, where he says, nothing new can replace the old unless we have a weltenflammende ethische Idee, which is a kind of paraphrase of his favorite poem by Schiller, this flammende, this picture of flames, and also a social effect of this idea. We need more than ideas. We need ways of conveying these ideas in ways that people are touched, maybe in chants, maybe in new myths, in speeches. So, and this can help winning egoism, an ideal that it has to be conveyed in this way. So basically, what does this mean? Rhetorics. And that's why he uses the term style, according to me. I was thinking, why style? Why comparing metaphysics with the style? Style is a rhetorical notion, first of all. So he was carrying, I think I'm done, just two slides. He was, as we will listen, I think in more detail in Chiara's talk, he was caring about the social question in Europe, and he was thinking that this could lead maybe just to intellectual struggles and battles, but it could also lead to a revolution, to something that could be compared to an earthquake that would deeply change our world. And this wouldn't happen, according to Lange, if we don't have the banner of a great idea. So again, this picture of the banner makes us think of this revolutionary context. And I want to point out at the margin that at that time, as we know, neo-Kantian philosophers struggled to talk about the revolution and materialism. So might also be a way to talk about these topics in a convoluted way, but I think it's very clear what he means. So finally, what was the problem with all this, of course? He claims that Kant's talk of a single architecture of reason is mistaken, that there's no single reason, single architectonic of human knowledge, and the validity of any philosophical system is like a style, and as a relative truth. But then, of course, the problem is, how can we claim the validity of the moral core of these ideals if they are historically relative? That's a problem. But anyway, he was thinking of an ideal poem, and Schiller was the closest it gets to realizing this poem, which would include the annihilation of metaphysics, which would express the logical relativity of all our concepts, and which would help our mind when the mechanism of the phenomenal world oppresses us and lead people to a world of ideas. That was his ideal. Just a final slide for the sake of our discussion, because that would be another talk, about how this problematic interpretation of poetry and Schiller had an ambivalent legacy. On the one hand, but we'll listen more about that tomorrow, there was a more Kantian reception where all this talk of mythology and replacing metaphysics with poems kind of disappears. And even scholars who were very close to Lange, for example, Hermann Cohen, went back to transcendentalism, to rational ethics, etc. Although some elements of Lange's philosophy were still there. And similarly, as had been argued also in a very interesting paper by Chiara Russo-Krauss, other kinds of neo-Kantianism with their theory of values might be related to Lange. But there's another side of the legacy, which led to ways that Lange wouldn't have liked, probably. Starting with Nietzsche and his reduction of truth in general to an army of metaphors, etc., which started with a very enthusiastic reading of Lange's History of Materialism, including other sources, but leading to first to a fully pragmatic view of truth, where Lange, we have seen, saves scientific truth as phenomenal, and this reappraisal of artistic ideals for their capacity to move, and mythology, of course. Politically speaking, Bernstein, for example, in his socialist revisionism, argued that we have to drop dialectical materialism and go back to Lange. So we need ideals. We can't predict the revolution. And then he brought Lange back to the debate in political philosophy. And surprisingly, and this is my last point, I will try to elaborate in the written version of this talk. Georges Sorel, who started as a socialist, got back to this double legacy of Lange, Nietzsche, and socialist revisionism by claiming that for social movements we need new myths, which are indispensable in order to, lead the masses. But we know that this kind of teaching was eventually appropriated by fascism. So that was a politically controversial legacy, and this reflects, I think, also the problematic status of Lange's interpretation in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for your very intense contribution. I think I can open the discussion for questions or comments. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for your talk. My first is clear what did it spoil? Because when I read the neo-Kantianism, I get kind of a powerful relation. That means I identify it with Marvel School in the Southwest.
Yeah.
Right? Now, and that's of course not correct. It would be normal that neo-Kantianism is much more movement. But still, what you indeed see in the talk, and I'm really glad that at the end you pointed out to yourself, that there are huge differences between Lange and both Marvel School and Southwest School. So, and then for me, of course, the question comes up, how do we evaluate this? How do we assess this? Well, you pointed out already, to go ahead in this reaction. You see here this talk of metaphysics, which respected to Southwest and Marvel School is, so to say, prohibited, this transcendental. But this poetry idea to reduce the intellectual world with poetry, all this changing. And question becomes, what's the value of an historical point of view? Okay, very close, but from a systematic point of view. What now is, so to say, the importance of the government? Is it the case that its interpretation makes sense? Is it the case that we have some so to say, foreigners with respect to normal students of history? How do you see it? What remains incredible?
Thank you. Well, that's not an easy question. First of all, of course, the labeling as neo-Kantian all these people is, of course, problematic in itself. We might start by considering that there were shared adversaries, post-Kantian idealism of such as Schelling and Hegel on the one hand, and their legacy in particular, which was also partly politically adverse, and the so-called scientific physiological materialism. And Lange starts to work on the project of the history of materialism, which is a history of materialism and critique of its present importance in that context of the materialism controversy, which was both a theoretical, scientific, and political controversy. So, of course, afterwards, things change, but Lange is very much affected by that controversy, and that's why I think he wants to get a lot of this materialist view. He says, I support a kind of materialism of the phenomenon. So all that you say, you that talk about our thoughts as neurophysiological processes, you're right, except this is all limited. And that's why he goes back to Kant. With a very complex itinerary, as you know, he was also a student of Herbart, etc. So he is basically as a psychological view. But then, so I think you also were asking this, why is this also interesting? Well, there are several stages. First, there was this label of physiological Kantianism, which basically started in the criticism by Marburg, or kind of Marburg neo-Kantianism towards these presidents. But then, well, myself, I started to get interested into Lange because I saw that compared to the transcendentalism of the, for example, of Cohen and Nathorp, and the way they deal with contemporary science, he was very much more into physiology and neurophysiology. And so it sounded like he was looking for a balance between the rising neurophysiology of his time. He devotes a big chapter to that, also in the second edition of the History of Materialism, very updated about the first electrophysiological experiments, and the philosophical necessity to save some different level of evaluation, aesthetical or moral, etc. That's why I use the term anti-reductionism. So in a way, at some stage, it looked Lange's attempt, although imperfect, sounded more interesting to me than the one that superseded it for decades.
I think I have three more questions. One is there, one is there, and one is there. I think we can go just following the line. Yeah.
So on your question, what I think please about Lange's heritage and what makes Lange very important. So I think Lange sees in this history of materialism that you cannot overcome the problem of materialistic worldview with a dualistic perspective in the old Kantian fashion. So, and not with idealism and the Fichtian conception. So you need something like a dualistic perspective, but in a dynamization of the dualism, because what he wants to point out is that we live in one world, and this one world has two perspectives. This is the materialistic foundation of phenomena, and some of the phenomena are thrown up in this one world, like values, for example. So this is a concept of idealization of what is the real world. And I'm not sure if your consequences is correct, that Lange is in favor of the relativism of values. I think he wants to avoid this relativism problem because naturalism leads us to relativism, and he wants to say, well, there is another sort of object connotation, and whose values are for us binding, obligatory. As we can discuss them, but they are not relative to our divided or singular standpoint. It's more than a standpoint ideology. So I think, yeah,
Yes, well, I quoted some passages. I don't mean that he wanted to accept that consequence, but I mean that it's problematic to hold what he wants. Because indeed, there's also in the first edition of the History of Materialism, in the section on Kant, he says most of what he says his argument is right, even the moral law, but it's not purely rational. But how so? So it's problematic. But of course, he didn't want that. And possibly, well, the general point, and that is clear, is this refusal to think of rationality and moral as something coming out of from nowhere. They belong to our experience. That's why he thinks they have to belong to our aesthetic experience. They affect us. They are language, basically. They happen in the phenomenal world. And possibly thought that even our sense of equality and our political ideas might be related to something experiential in this sense. But I didn't find any sharply formulated argument about how to have the kind of moral political idea that he wanted, and at the same time argue that you don't have any absolutely valid system. But yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll try to make this very, very quickly. Really, it's just follow up on your last answer. So if I'm getting it right, the relativism of value based on poetical conception of value is a consequence of Lange's view, but it's not a consequence that Lange fully recognizes. And if he did fully recognize it, he wouldn't like it. So it's almost as if like you are criticizing Lange here, right?
Well, when I decided to end my talk showing how by reading Lange people started to make claims that he didn't want, I was just suggesting that this position is problematic. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have one last question, right? Please.
Well, my question is also somewhat a follow-up to what we told before. I was interested in your passage about the gravity of the architectonics of reason. And so my first question would be, the main technical regions, the review for evaluating the best architectonic or the worst, or to compare them, is only pragmatic in a sense. There is some kind of objective criterion or some kind of objective process concerning the alternance of systems. And then how of this related in the struggle with the cinema side, the struggle with pessimism, yet there is no progress. There might be questions.
Yes, as I was saying before, this is problematic because when discusses this notion of architecture, he quotes a passage from Kant where Kant suggests that maybe the different systems of philosophy have a kind of development. They can be connected into a narrative of progress. And he said, this is exactly what Hegel later did, but it's wrong. Because you can't find this logic of historical succession. What happens is that any kind of architectonic, any kind of system of values and view of the world is related to a historical context. So of course, then it's problematic to argue why Lange, how Lange defends his own view as a viewpoint on all these past debates. And I've just found some very short instances. As I said before, I didn't find a sharply formulated argument about this by Lange. I have to investigate more, maybe also in other writings. because that was, I think, this kind of gap might be filled by reading Lange's social political writings, where he describes the state of society and how a majority of people intrinsically tend to agree on some points. But that's an hypothesis. I have to work on it then.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, this is something
In the computer.
Thank you for the presence.
Again.
I think while Chiara prepares the instruments, I'm going to introduce her as second speaker. Chiara Russo, Associate Professor of History and Philosophy at Naples University, Federico II. Her field of expertise is German philosophy of the 19th century, with particular focus on empirical criticism, neo-Kantianism, and the debate on the foundation of scientific psychology. Her recently published books are the philosophy of Joseph Petzold, Wundt, Avenarius, and scientific psychology, philosophers, and Einstein's relativity, edited together with Luigi Vani. The title of Chiara's paper, I think, underwent a slight change compared to the original program. Now reads as follows. Chiara, please correct me if I'm wrong. Materialism, Ideas and Poetry, Friedrich Albert Lange's interpretation of Schiller, and the reform of Kantianism.
Okay,
Is it correct? No.
no,
You-
it was this,
This was the old one.
yeah, no,
Okay.
it was Paolo Pecere's title, not mine.
Really?
Yeah,
So-
okay, no problem.
I think my notes are wrong.
No problem, because as you will see,
With-
my talk
Yeah.
and Paolo Pecere's talk share a lot of similarities, not only because we touch on the same topic, but also because I think we can say we share a similar understanding of Lange's philosophy in general. But I hope you will see that I will stress different elements of Lange's philosophy and offer a different reconstruction, so that I hope I won't just repeat Paolo's points, but I hope you will see that our talks support, integrate, and complement one another. So in particular, I wanted to start from this quote from Lange's book, Die Arbeiterfrage, which says that the aesthetic redemption that Schiller reserved for only a select few is probably more closely connected to the solution of the social question than one might initially think, provided such a solution can be found without undergoing a general catastrophe. So my goal was to try to explain this statement. And of course, this also means an attempt to show that Lange's philosophy is not divided into two different parts, as some scholars have suggested. So one more philosophical and erkenntnistheoretisch, if you want, in the Geschichte des Materialismus, and another completely separated side that is more political philosophy, the one presented in the Arbeiterfrage. So, of course, in order to try to explain this statement by Lange, I will also refer back to the Geschichte des Materialismus. And I think it is important to answer this question of the meaning of this sentence, because it takes us right at the heart of Lange's philosophical project, which, as we in part already have seen, aimed to find a philosophy that could solve the problems of his time. And of course, as we all know, Lange's age was characterized by the rapid advances in science, so the so-called scientific revolution. And we also know that these advances led to a resurgence of materialism and the subsequent Materialismusstreit. And as we have seen, Lange does not oppose scientific materialism per se, but he regards it as a necessary heuristic hypothesis. So for him, the problem was when this more kind of theoretical and scientific materialism becomes intertwined with another form of materialism, which Lange calls ethical materialism. And we may say that this was the way of thinking exemplified by classical economics. So the idea of the homo economicus who is driven solely by self-interest. So the problem for Lange was that these two forms of materialism converge to form a broader system of beliefs, which Lange terms dogmatic egoism. And of course, it is dogmatic because it claims to be the ultimate indisputable truth, and it is egoistic in that it asserts that the human beings are nothing but animals in a universe devoid of any superior power, so that ultimately the motivation for our action, as I said, is only self-interest. So Lange's project was to find a philosophy that could counter this materialist, egoist worldview, but of course he was aware that it wasn't possible to simply return to a time of metaphysical certainty and religious beliefs and ignoring the results of science. So one needed a philosophy capable of fostering the spiritual and moral dimension of man without appealing to metaphysics and while also recognizing the advances in science. And of course, the blueprint for such a philosophy was Kantianism, because on the one hand, Kant's philosophy provided a theory of knowledge for the sciences and the critique of metaphysics, while on the other hand, it constructed a practical philosophy capable of supporting the moral element within human beings, with ideas such as man's destination to freedom, the kingdom of ends, the idea of humanity, and so on. And in this regard, I find particularly interesting to note that in the preface to the first edition of the History of Materialism, Lange writes the following: from a purely theoretical point of view, the issues at stake are already clear to many in all their significance. Indeed, Kant has recently gained greater recognition, particularly among natural scientists, and probably he's thinking about Helmholtz in saying this. And the enduring elements of his philosophy are becoming increasingly widespread among leading thinkers, even outside the narrow circle of academic philosophy. But the problem is that these thinkers and these natural scientists clearly abandoned an essential element of Kant's view, which consists in the sincere appreciation of the ideas whose theoretical groundlessness Kant demonstrates. So this means that already in 1866, Lange regarded the resurgence of Kant's theory of knowledge to be like an already accomplished fact. What was still missing was the renewal of the other side of Kant's philosophy that was necessary to secure the values of the ideas. So the other side of Kant's philosophy that Lange also calls Kant's rescue of ideas on a practical level, Rettung der Ideen auf praktischen Weg. So I think that on this basis, we may say that Lange's project was not really to restore Kant's theory of knowledge, because this was a task that had already been achieved, but rather to restore his practical philosophy. And however, the reason why Lange's contemporaries recovered Kant's theory of knowledge, but rejected his practical philosophy, was that it was precisely the second side of Kant's philosophy that contained the seeds for the resurgence of metaphysics in the years that followed and within the idealistic tradition. So we know that there is this problem for which, in a sense, a practical philosophy in Kant is the window through which Kant let re-enter what he initially threw out of the door. And of course, this is metaphysics. So the point is that if Lange wanted to revive Kant's practical philosophy, he had to rework it in a way that avoided any relapse into metaphysics. And as we will see, Schiller was the key figure in achieving such a Kantian ethics freed from all its metaphysical residuals. But before we see how Schiller should help us to correct Kant, I want to focus on what Lange regarded as the merits and mistakes of Kant's practical philosophy. I won't read all this because we already saw the same quote in Paolo's talk. And as we have seen, Lange regards the first 2 points as the core elements that we must uphold from Kant's philosophy. And the first one is Kant's theory of knowledge. And as we have seen, it is something that we already recovered from Lange's point of view. So the second point is what Lange wants to revive and bring back into fashion. And this is how he summarized Kant's practical philosophy. But it is interesting to see which terms Lange uses to summarize Kant's philosophy, because he says, ideas do not give us knowledge, but lead us into an imaginary world. Therein lies their usefulness. We deceive ourselves when we try to expand our knowledge through them. We enrich ourselves when we make them the basis of our actions. So we see this strong emphasis on the fact that ideas are linked to this construction of an imaginary world. And Lange is even more adamant about this in the second edition when he summarized Kant's concept, Kant's point of view in this way. In the phenomenal world, everything hangs together as cause and effect. To this, the human will is no exception. It is entirely subject to the law of nature. But this law of nature itself, with the whole succession of events, is only phenomenon, and the natural disposition of our reason necessarily leads us to assume, besides the world that we perceive with our senses, another imaginary world. So again, this expression. And this imaginary world, so far as we form any definite idea of it, is a world of illusion, a figment of the brain. So again, this emphasis on the production of imaginary, illusory ideas is an integral part of Lange's reading of Kant. And I think that we may say that Lange's interpretation of Kant was that Kant's fundamental intuition was that human reason has 2 main areas of application. So when applied to the experience, reason serves us to know the world, and its goal is to achieve truth. But reason also has the ability to produce images that are not constrained by empirical data, and this is the realm of imagination. So the ideas produced by imagination are neither real nor true, and therefore they do not contribute to knowledge, but they still have a fundamental function. And in particular, they have a practical function in that they serve to exercise a moral effect, as Lange says. So this is the fundamental intuition of Kant's ethics, according to Lange. The fact that although ideas are not real or true per se, they have real effects on the empirical world because they can determine our behavior. And accordingly, Lange reinterprets Kant, you ought, therefore you can, as a sort of mechanism of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we start from the idea that it is impossible to act freely because our behavior is entirely determined by prior causes or by our sensible inclinations, then we will end up acting determined by those causes and inclinations, and therefore we will not be free. On the other hand, if we imagine that we are free to determine ourselves, free to do our duty, even if this idea is false, it can still have an effect on our behavior by making us act according to this false, fictitious, imaginary idea. And in this way, we will actually become free in the sense that we will not act according to the circumstances, the inclinations, but according to our ideas. So in the words of Lange, sorry for the long quote, just because man conceives the unconditional fulfilling of the moral law as possible, a conditional influence also is exercised upon its real and not its merely imaginary accomplishment. So there is no need to read the rest, but the main point is this: even if the ideas are false, they have a real effect. And according to Lange, this is already in Kant's practical philosophy. And so he regards as the core of Kant's philosophy precisely this intuition about the power of fictitious ideas in determining our behavior. And of course, one may say that this is how can I say, a questionable reconstruction of Kant's practical philosophy. But I don't have time to explore more on this. I have a paper on this argument. There is a grounding of this interpretation of Kant's philosophy in the first critique and in the notion developed by Kant of freedom in the practical sense. Because the Kantian concept of freedom in the practical sense is entirely compatible with the causal determinism, and it is a concept of freedom that only regards the phenomenal man. So, according to Lange, the problem with Kant was that he didn't stop at this concept. He didn't stop at the concept of freedom in the practical sense, because, as we know, Kant also introduced a different concept of freedom, that is the idea of transcendental freedom as absolute spontaneity and uncaused beginning. But however, in the first critique, this was still a mere idea of reason, the idea of transcendental freedom. Again, according to Lange, the problem begins with the second critique, in which for the first time, Kant suggests that this freedom and spontaneity is not just an idea. It is something that really exists, even though not in the phenomenal realm, but in the nominal dimension. And also Kant suggests that we do have a knowledge of this transcendental freedom through the moral action. And of course, this is where all the problems start to arise, because then we have a double causation, because the same course of action is determined twice, one nominally and one phenomenally. And also we have a shift in which morality no longer regards the phenomenal man and the phenomenal realm, which according to Kant himself is the world that we actually inhabit, but regards this vague idea of the nominal dimension and the nominal man. And also, through the notion of transcendental freedom as it is presented in the second critique, Kant negates the limits of knowledge that he himself had set, because he now says that it is indeed possible to have some knowledge of something nominal, like our nominal freedom. So, according to Lange, if we want to revive Kant's practical philosophy, which is Lange's aim, as I said, we have to ditch this second idea of freedom and stick to Kant's original intuition, according to which the main element is this power of fictitious idea in determining our behavior. And we have to avoid Kant's temptation of attributing reality and truthfulness to our ideas. And in order to do this, of course, he resorts to Schiller, as I anticipated before, because by connecting ethics and aesthetics, Schiller avoided the temptation of attributing truth to our ideas, and instead he brought them into this other dimension, the aesthetic dimension of imagination, poetry, Dichtung, and so on. And there are several passages about this role of Schiller throughout Lange's work, but let us look at this quote in particular from the History of Materialism. We already read it in Paolo's talk, but I want to highlight in particular 3 points because I think they summarize Lange's interpretation of Schiller. And the first one is, as I've said, that Schiller's fundamental merit lays in acknowledging that the ideas belong to this realm of fantasy, this world of imagination. Because in doing so, as I've said, Schiller avoided Kant's temptation of attributing a cognitive value to them. And second, when we recognize that our ideas are fictitious creations and not something that is true, they are not lessened in a way, but they are even stronger because now they cannot be refuted, as we have seen before. One cannot refute Beethoven, so one cannot even refute these moral ideas of imaginary world. And also they become more powerful because we now recognize that the power of the ideas is not in their truth, but in their beauty. And finally, a third recurring point in Lange's interpretation of Schiller is that the core of Schiller's philosophy is not contained in his essays, but rather in his poems. And as we have also seen in one particular poem of Schiller, Das Ideal und das Leben. And so I think it is particularly important to focus on this poem because, in particular, to answer the question about the meaning of Lange's quote from which I started, because Lange says that the theory of aesthetic redemption is presented to us by Das Ideal und das Leben in its most perfect form. So if we want to understand how the theory of aesthetic redemption is connected to the solution of the social question, we have to look at Lange's interpretation of this poem. And in particular, according to Lange, this poem shows that Schiller understood that freedom is primarily the ability of our imagination to detach from reality by creating a fictional picture of an alternative, better world that is devoid of all the shortcomings of the real one, which, as we have seen, was the main intuition of Kant ethics, according to Lange. So Schiller took up this intuition by Kant and made it even more evident in a way. And as we see, and as we know, in the poem, Schiller describes this concept lyrically by contrasting the earthly realm inhabited by mortals, life, with the perfect, beautiful realm of the Olympian gods, which is the ideal. And in this way, Schiller expresses the idea that what defines humanity is this ability to escape reality, escape life, and ascend to a realm of perfection, the ideal. But according to Lange, this is expressed even more vividly in the central part of the poem, which Lange regards as its most significant section. And this part is made of 4 pairs of stanzas, and in each pair, the first stanza begins with the conjunction when, as you can see, and this then presents us with a situation that we encounter in life, in empirical reality, with all its problems, struggles, ugliness, suffering, and so on. While the second stanza of each pair begins with the adversative conjunction aber, that introduces the idea reversal of the situation presented in the first stanza. So the first pair contrasts a stanza describing the reality of constant conflict and competition among men, with a stanza describing the idea of a peaceful union among human beings. The second pair contrasts a stanza describing the reality of strenuous work with the idea of a faultless artistic creation. The third pair contrasts the reality of man's inadequacy in the face of duty with the ideal of graceful adherence to moral law. And finally, the reality of human suffering is reversed in the ideal of peace of mind. So now this is something maybe I add to Lange's interpretation, but to highlight why he thinks that this poem by Schiller is so important, and in particular why these 4 pairs of stanzas are so important. I think that the main point, the heavy lifting in the poem is done by the adversative conjunction aber, because this conjunction emphasizes the idea that human freedom lies in the power of the imagination to break away from reality, because all the other animals simply are doomed to accept the reality as it is. They only inhabit life. And man alone has the ability to reject reality because he can set it against his ideal vision of how things should be. So only man knows the real world, knows reality, knows life, and also has the ability to say, wait a minute, but things should be different, but things should be so and so, but I can imagine a different world in which things go in this and this and this way. And as already Schiller clarifies, this point is not, this ability of man to escape in this ideal dimension is not really an escape, is not something that serves us to release us from the battle, as he says in the poem, because if we try to flee from reality, life will always pull us back in a way. So since imagining this ideal alternative world is not really escape reality, its real function is to be a step that allows us to change the course of things. Because the true liberation from suffering from all the shortcomings of life and reality is not achieving by this impossible escape in another world, but by changing the world according to our ideals. And this is why the poem ends with the image of Hercules' apotheosis, because like human beings, Hercules is partly an earthly creature and part an inhabitant of this divine ideal realm. But the point is that Hercules can only reach this godly dimension and be liberated from the earthly imperfections and suffering after completing his labor. And so similarly, humanity can be liberated from its suffering and achieve a more perfect status only through the work of its own hands. So I think that for Lange, this is the true sense of Schiller's aesthetic redemption. And this is also supported by the fact that Lange openly criticizes the notion of aesthetic redemption as it is presented in the letters on the education of men. Because in this treatise, Schiller suggests that aesthetic redemption means that fine art on its own has this inherent power to elevate mankind and guide us out of our struggles. So as Lange writes, Schiller too fell into this error of such confusion between construction and proof, but only in his treatises and not in his poetry. And the most significant example of a speculative construction pretending to be proof can be found in Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man. In this thought-provoking treatise, which is still relevant today in many respects, Schiller becomes completely absorbed in the idea that the barbaric brutality of our states can only be overcome by cultivating beauty, and that we cannot better work toward the future realization of the rational state than by quietly working on the aesthetic ennoblements of mind, rather than seeking freedom through political means. So this is Schiller's mistake, according to Lange, the idea that aesthetic redemption can mean that fine art can exempt us from the political work. And instead, the true idea of aesthetic redemption is the one presented in Das Idealum, das Leben, and is the idea that fine art, the imagination of ideas, is the first step toward the real work. And according to Lange, of course, this is the political work of changing the reality. So to summarize, according to Lange, as I've said, the true concept of aesthetic redemption is not that thanks to beauty's inherent elevating power, we can focus on fine art and disregard the political action. But the true meaning is that the imagination of beautiful ideas serves us to free us from the constraint of reality, to disregard the reality, and then serves us to motivate us to take action and change the world, so that the artistic creation is not a surrogate of political action, but its precondition. So I will conclude by summarizing how Schiller could have helped to solve the social question according to Lange. So as we have seen, the main merits of Schiller were, first, he maintained the main intuition of Kant ethics, that is, the practical role of ideas that are not true, but products of our imagination. And at the same time, Schiller liberated this intuition by Kant from its metaphysical residuals by bringing ethics under the domain of aesthetics. And second, by turning Kantian ethics into a work of art, Schiller not only freed it from its metaphysics, but also made it more powerful. Because, of course, Kant's idea of freedom or the kingdom of ends and so on were already beautiful ideas, but they were like hidden behind Kant's difficult prose and scholastic style of reasoning. So since Schiller had this more poetical capacity, he was able to deliver the Kantian ideas in a more effective way, with more style, we can say. So the point is, how does this help us solve the social question? We may say that Lange thought that after the Industrial Revolution, mankind was at a crossroad, because the Industrial Revolution meant an unprecedented surge in the capacity to produce goods. And this unprecedented surge in the capacity to produce goods could develop in two opposite ways. It could further increase the economic divide between the majority of workers and the minority of privileged individuals, because in this scenario, the rise in the production would primarily benefit the elite by increasing the production of luxury goods. And meanwhile, the workers would become even more exploited, as their survival would be in the hands of the employers who pay their salaries. So that in the end, the Industrial Revolution would only perpetuate and reinforce the subjugation of men by men. On the other hand, the Industrial Revolution could also go in a completely different direction and benefit humanity. If the increased production of goods were used to ensure that everyone's needs are met, and if this increased ability to produce goods in less time would be used to reduce the working hours and so allow more free time for the workers. And eventually this would mean freeing mankind from the struggle for existence, as man would no longer need to devote all his energies, all his hours, all his days to survival, but could instead pursue higher self-given purposes, so a more spiritual life in a way. And according to Lange, freedom coincides precisely with the liberation from the struggle for existence. As he writes, the struggle against the struggle for existence is identical with the higher spiritual destination of man. So the Industrial Revolution could mean either a further subjugation of man or a decisive step towards our destination to freedom. But what determines if the Industrial Revolution will go in one direction or the other? As we have already seen, it is the power of ideas. So as Lange writes, the victory over disintegrating egoism and the deadly chilliness of the heart will only be won by a great ideal, which appears amidst the wandering peoples as a stranger from another world, and by demanding the impossible, unhinges the reality. And this is precisely the function of aesthetic redemption, because as we have seen, only beautiful ideas or ideas have the capacity to unhinge reality. And of course, here Lange mentions another poem by Schiller, Die Macht des Gesanges, when he speaks about this ideal as a stranger from another world. But again, the meaning is the same that we already encountered in Das Ideal und das Leben. So the point is that the aesthetic imagination of ideals breaks us free from the constraint of accepting reality as it is. Because we may say that perhaps it is true that we are just animals struggling to survive and only concerned with our own selfish interest. But as we have seen before, we can imagine an alternative reality in which we don't have to struggle to survive and society is based on the common good. And if we can imagine this ideal, we can then work to realize it. And the Industrial Revolution will give us the means to realize this ideal. I think this is the social, but we will see that quote again later. So, okay, I'm about to end my presentation. Again, as I've said, we are at this, or Lange was at this crossroad, and what to decide whether it goes in one direction or the other is the power of ideas, because if we accept ethical materialism, and we believe that human beings are merely animals who care only for their interests, then we will have a society in which the egoism of the capitalist class knows no limits, in terms both of the accumulation of luxury goods and the exploitation of workers. On the other hand, if we believe that human beings are more than animals and should strive to freedom and dignity, then we can work towards a society in which the technological progress is used to ease work and produce goods for the benefit of all. So this is why Lange writes that a current of materialism runs through our modern civilization, which carries away with it everyone who has not somewhere found firm anchorage. Philosophers and economists, statesmen and businessmen agree in praising the present and its achievements, and with the praise of the present is combined the cult of actuality. So ethical materialism is precisely this praise of the present, the cult of reality, because it is the idea that reality is immutable. And on the other hand, aesthetic redemption is the liberation from the cult of the present and the praise of the present and the cult of reality, because only this aesthetic redemption enables us to imagine that things could be different and then work to realize the world as we would like it to be. And so in order to solve the social question, one needs precisely this belief in beautiful ideas. And this was what Schiller taught us. And of course, this can also be seen as a criticism of Marx and his idea of scientific socialism, and Marx's criticism of utopian thinkers, because according to Lange, we need these utopian beliefs in beautiful ideas if we want to change the world and make it better in a way. So thank you. This is all.
Thank you, Chiara. I'm sorry for my misreading of your title. I was
No problem.
You changed it, I remember. That's why I didn't interrupt you. I'm a very bad time guardian. So looking at your eyes, some of you are tired and need a coffee, but you have to deserve it by asking questions to Chiara.
Thank you very much. So I agree with your perspective on political. It seems to me that more these critics are right that this theory is the theory of avoiding individualism, and this is the big neck of neo-Kantianism, and we say bracket perception to the power that there is no theory of institutions. Because this process of idealization is an individual process, so that we overcome our reality and build up some ideas, but there are always ideas objectified in the world, here, university, state, church, whatever, would you agree with this perspective on Lano, or would you say that he has somewhere hidden or a theory of institutions?
I think that there are several layers in Lange's view about how historical changes happen. There is definitely almost a fascination with these historical figures who were capable of creating or expressing beautiful ideas such as Kant, Schiller, or even Hegel, he mentions in the, or Fichte, and so on. But he also says that the content of the ideas is connected to a sort of taste that is something that changes throughout time, so that there is also an element of the ability of these great men of reading the pulse of their time, maybe. So not something that is just an individualistic effort, but also the capacity of read the times, maybe. And then there is also a whole other area of Lange's conception as presented in the Arbeiterfrage, in which he doesn't believe in institutions in the sense that change can come, as we can say, from the top down, but he really believes in cooperation and in the fact that if we construct the communities, then we will be able to develop this more altruistic way of thinking. So it's not just great individuals who can deliver great ideas, but historical change also needs a shifting of the whole vibe of the time, and this construction from the bottom up of communities that allow us to become less egoistic, I would say.
Okay, I already have two more reservations, and according to the order of my perception, first Professor Prisco and then Professor Vada.
Can I use the microphone now?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yeah, you should.
So thank you so much, and I'm interested, of course, about how you touched on one of the missing pieces in my reconstruction. A question that I didn't answer in a satisfactory way. So why Schiller? And we were discussing before about the problem of justifying the content of values or moral values, and possibly you suggested an answer. I want to hear what you think. So, because the problem is, if you have this idea of fictionalized ideals, I might dream of a world where my nation and my friends rule the world and the slaves obey. That's a random idea. Won't happen. So why does that not work? And possibly Lange sees in this vision of the Olympic world, I didn't think about it, the world where there's no suffering, so as a kind of universality where nobody has to suffer, which would be a way of poetic representation of a kind of Kantian ethics, but not based on a rational argument of the test of the moral law, but based on the impact of this beautiful vision. So might that be why Lange chooses Schiller, besides the fact that he was a famous poet?
Okay. So I tried to answer this question of that we were also discussing after your presentation in my paper about Lange's theory of values, and I don't have the boldness to claim that is a definitive answer, but I think that it is possible to solve this puzzle about whether Lange's theory is just a sort of psychological theory of motivation in which we are motivated by ideals and beautiful images, and this can be images like me being a dictator, as well as Kant kingdom of ends. So there is no possibility to distinguish whether one is good or not. Or if there is like a normative element in Lange's philosophy, and whether he builds a conceptual mechanism that allow us to distinguish between these two very different ideas. And I believe that it is key to understand that according to Lange, every human representation, so since he's a phenomenalist, everything we believe is a mixture of matter and form, a sensible matter and organized according to a form. And of course, as you say in your paper, this is already at the lowest level of perception, which are already formally organized. But if we start from this assumption, then we can say that whatever brings us closer to the idea or the pure idea of form, which is devoid of content, and of course means that it cannot be visualized in everything, in anything. But the more we strive toward the form, toward unity, toward harmony, the closer we are to what matters, what has value, what is normative. So one can distinguish between these ideas in that Kant's idea of kingdom of ends, of course, is this universal harmonic image, whether while me being the dictator may be appealing to me, but has no harmony, has no unity, has not a real formal value. And this also allows us to say if ideals are something purely relative and historically changing, or something that has a universal and everlasting element, because the formal tendency, this form drive is universal and everlasting, while since a pure form doesn't exist, it always has to take to have an empirical matter and be incarnated in an empirical matter, and this union is what is historically changing. So the way in which we take our material and then transform it according to a certain form. The form drive is universal, and the way in which we bring form to our reality is historically changing.
You need a microphone or?
No, it's fine. I very much liked your reconstruction of Lange's ideas. I thought it was correct and very illuminating. However, I have another question which goes a bit outside our present frame of reference. I'm wondering how much Lange's discussion of that of this relates to what Lotze was doing. Lotze is an immensely influential figure right around this time, and he will not more influential, in fact, than Lange. And in the third book of his Logik, Lotze provides an interpretation of Kantian ideas, which is very interesting and was very influential. And he makes this distinction between truths and validity, or between Wahrheit and Gültigkeit. And ideas, he says, can have Gültigkeit. They can be valid, universal, but they have no real truth. But he would say that Lange's search for a pragmatic criterion of truth, to use these ideas as a way to form reality, he said that's not necessary. These ideas have Gültigkeit in and of themselves without any need to refer to any sensible ground whatsoever. He would value all that as a big mistake. And so Lotze is his own account of ideas is in fact also very Platonic, just in the way in which Lange is in a way. And he says in the third book of the Logik, there's this wonderful truth that ideas can have Gültigkeit, ohne Wahrheit. And he says, this is really good. And this is the method by which we should give validity to our ideas, by interpreting them as Gültigkeit and the Baha. And this was a very big idea amongst a lot of neo-Kantians and others who came after them. Cohen would be one of them. Bruno Bauch would be another. So this just seems to be another thing to confuse or to complicate the analysis. I think you're right about the account you give of Lange, but there's also, just as a point of contrast, there's the case of Lotze, who has this very different interpretation, very interesting indeed, and how that would relate to the Islamics. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, and maybe you do. I'll leave that open to you.
Okay, I don't have a definitive answer for this question. Of course, since I wrote a paper that is called The Lange's Theory of Values, I believe that it is interesting to look at these early neo-Kantians or thinkers of the first half of the 19th century, such as Lotze, to try to retrace the origins of the two world theories of the distinction between facts and values. And of course, both Lange, according to me, and of course also Lotze are forerunners in the history of this development of the two world theory. I don't know if Lange takes up this idea from Lotze. It may be, probably he knew him. I don't know. Lange quotes so many authors throughout the Geschichte des Materialismus that is almost impossible to remember everyone he mentions. Yeah, but I think another possibility is that we can find a similar theory of this distinction between facts and values as presented by Lotze in Fechner, who was very close to Lotze when they were both in Leipzig, I think. And if one reads the Elemente der Psychophysik, Fechner develops similar ideas about we can study the mind entirely in a scientific way, and there is this whole other dimension, which is the value and qualitative elements of the representation. And of course, Lange knew and mentioned Fechner, so this might also be an indirect link to Lotze. And
I don't know. I'm asking.
maybe.